On the evening of October 8th, 2025, a SWAT team surrounded a modest home in southwest Atlanta. They'd gotten a tip that someone was hiding inside. Someone dangerous. Someone who'd been on the run for nearly 5 months. The officers deployed tear gas canisters into the residence multiple times, forcing their way through room by room. They searched the basement. Nothing. They checked every closet, every corner. Still nothing. Then one officer noticed something odd about the crawl space. It looked like someone had reinforced it. Someone had prepared to hide there for a very long time. When they finally pulled back the panel, there he was. 28-year-old Derrick Groves, the last of 10 inmates who'd pulled off one of the most audacious jailbreaks in Louisiana history, was finally cornered. But here's what makes this story even more complicated. The capture of Derrick Groves wasn't celebrated by everyone. In fact, across social media, thousands of people were rooting for him to stay free. Keep that detail in mind, because when you understand why, you'll see how one corrupt cop's actions 30 years ago created ripples that are still destroying lives today. But before we dive into today's story, if you love complex cases with multiple layers, shocking twists, and stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about crime and justice, then you're in the right place. Because that's exactly what I deliver, and I post new content 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please escape from jail through a hole behind a toilet. Leave graffiti saying, "To easy lol," and evade authorities for 5 months. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which begins in New Orleans, Louisiana on Mardi Gras Day, February 13th, 2018. It was Fat Tuesday, and the streets of New Orleans were packed with celebrating crowds. By evening, most of the parades had ended, but the parties were still going strong across the city. In the lower 9th Ward, a large group had gathered outside a home on St. Claude Avenue near Andry Street. It was a family gathering, full of men, women, and children enjoying the tail end of Mardi Gras. Around 8:15 that night, 2 figures emerged from the darkness carrying AK-47-style assault rifles. They opened fire on the crowd. Bullets tore through the air indiscriminately. People screamed and scattered, diving for cover as the gunmen unloaded round after round into the gathering. When the shooting finally stopped, 26-year-old Jamar Robinson and 21-year-old Byron Jackson were dead inside a car. 3 other people lay wounded on the ground. The shooters disappeared into the night. Police quickly identified the gunmen as Derrick Groves and Kendall Barnes, both members of a drug-dealing gang called the Tupelo Money Boys. Investigators believed they'd been hired to kill a man named Richard Green, a rival dealer who was partying with the victims. But Green survived. Robinson and Jackson didn't. Prosecutors would later reveal that the Mardi Gras shooting stemmed from an ongoing gang war that had already claimed multiple lives. In November 2017, a man named Eddie Celestine was murdered in New Orleans East. At his repast, another shooting occurred. The Mardi Gras attack was retaliation for that shooting. It was a cycle of violence that kept spiraling out of control. And at the center of it all was Derrick Groves, a young man who prosecutors described as someone who routinely used violence to lash out and silence anyone he considered a snitch. Groves was arrested in early 2019, and that's when the real legal nightmare began. In October 2019, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Case closed. Except it wasn't. The conviction was reached by a 10-2 split jury, meaning not all 12 jurors agreed. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that non-unanimous jury verdicts were unconstitutional. Groves got a new trial. The second trial ended in a mistrial after an FBI agent's testimony was deemed prejudicial. The third trial deadlocked with a hung jury. Finally, in October 2024, after his fourth trial, a unanimous jury found Groves guilty once again. He was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder, and prosecutors revealed he'd also pleaded guilty to 2 separate manslaughter charges for the 2017 killing of Woodrow Smith and the 2019 slaying of Tyrone Francis. Derrick Groves was a 4-time convicted killer. He was awaiting his formal sentencing hearing, which would carry mandatory life sentences, when he saw an opportunity he couldn't pass up. On May 16, 2025, at approximately 12:23 in the morning, Groves and 9 other inmates at the Orleans Parish Justice Center began executing a plan. They'd spent weeks, maybe months, preparing for this moment. The jail had faulty locks on many cell doors. The inmates knew this. They forced open a sliding cell door, pulling it right off its tracks, and entered an empty cell designated for disabled inmates. Inside that cell was a toilet and sink. This is where things get interesting. The inmates had help. A maintenance worker named Sterling Williams had been approached by one of the inmates, Antoine Massey, who allegedly threatened to shank him if he didn't cooperate. Williams turned off the water supply to that cell. With the water off, the inmates ripped the toilet completely off the wall without flooding the cell, which would have drawn immediate attention. Behind the toilet was a hole in the wall used for plumbing pipes. The inmates cut through the horizontal bars, widened the opening, and one by one, they crawled through. Above the hole, they left graffiti that read, "To Easy Lol" and "We Innocent." They made their way through the facility to a loading dock, used stolen blankets to protect themselves from barbed wire, scaled the perimeter fence, and escaped onto nearby railroad tracks. From there, they had easy access to the interstate. They were gone. The escape wasn't discovered until 8:30 that morning, more than 7 hours after they'd fled. No deputy had been assigned to monitor that area, and a civilian employee who should have been watching surveillance cameras had stepped away to get food. Derrick Groves was free, so were 9 other dangerous criminals. The manhunt began immediately. Within days, authorities recaptured 5 of the escapees, but Groves and 4 others remained at large, and that's when things got really complicated. Because Derrick Groves isn't just another criminal, he's the grandson of Kim Groves, and Kim Groves was murdered by one of the most corrupt police officers in New Orleans history. In 1994, Kim Groves was a 32-year-old mother of 3 living in the lower 9th Ward. On October 11th of that year, she witnessed NOPD officer Len Davis and his partner brutally beating a 17-year-old boy they'd mistaken for a suspect. Kim filed a police brutality complaint against Davis. She thought she was doing the right thing. Len Davis was already under FBI surveillance for running a massive drug protection racket. He was on wiretapped phone lines when he learned about Kim's complaint. And on those recordings, FBI agents heard him orchestrate her murder. Davis called a local drug dealer named Paul Hardy and ordered the hit. He even helped Hardy find Kim, driving around her neighborhood in his patrol car to locate her. On October 13, 1994, less than 1 day after Kim filed her complaint, Hardy shot her in the head execution style in front of her home. She died instantly. Her children watched her die. Len Davis was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to death for conspiring to violate Kim Groves' civil rights through murder. He became the first on-duty police officer sentenced to death for federal civil rights violations. In December 2024, President Biden commuted his sentence to life without parole. Derrick Groves was born nearly 3 years after his grandmother's murder. He grew up knowing the story. He grew up seeing the spot where she was killed, marked with flowers. He grew up hearing about the corrupt cop who'd ordered the hit. And he grew up in a neighborhood that had lost all faith in police. Some people believe that trauma shaped him. After Groves escaped, social media exploded with support. Posts with hashtags like I Stay Free Woo and Justice for Kim Groves went viral. People wrote that they hoped he'd never be found. They saw him not just as a criminal, but as a victim of generational trauma, another casualty in a cycle of violence that began with his grandmother's murder. The Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office pushed back hard, calling any connection between Kim's murder and Derrick's crimes a newly generated urban myth. They pointed out that Derrick had killed 4 people. He'd opened fire on a crowd of families celebrating Mardi Gras. Whatever trauma he'd experienced didn't justify the terror he'd inflicted on others. The manhunt continued through the summer. Federal marshals, Louisiana State Police, the FBI, and multiple local agencies worked together to track down the remaining escapees. Tips poured in from across the country. Slowly, the net tightened. Then, in early October, authorities received a tip through Crime Stoppers that Groves was hiding in Atlanta. The Southeast Regional Fugitive Task Force moved in. On October 8th, they surrounded the home on Honeysuckle Lane in southwest Atlanta. After the standoff and search, they found him in that reinforced crawl space. He was taken into custody without injury and without weapons. He'd been on the run for 145 days. The capture made headlines immediately. Derrick Groves faces additional charges now for the escape itself. He'll be extradited back to Louisiana to face those charges on top of his existing life sentences. His girlfriend, Dariana Burton, a former Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office employee, was arrested back in June for allegedly helping coordinate his escape. The maintenance worker, Sterling Williams, remains charged with 10 counts of principal to simple escape. Multiple relatives of other escapees have also been arrested for providing assistance. Derrick Groves' story is a tragedy with no heroes. His grandmother was murdered by a corrupt cop. He grew up surrounded by violence and trauma. But he also chose to perpetuate that violence, killing 4 people and terrorizing an entire community. The debate rages on. Is he a product of systemic failure and generational trauma? Absolutely. Does that excuse his actions? Absolutely not. Both things can be true at the same time. So that's gonna do it. Until next time, see ya.